Do you remember the 4th of October 1962? Almost certainly not. It's a day like any other. Bit grey, perhaps, uneventful. Yet just 24 hours later, on the 5th of October, 50 years ago today, modern Britain was born. Well, big screen Bond and the Beatles at least. Two of the most powerful brands of modern British culture. The first brand, Bond. James Bond. Dr. No was released in cinemas on October the 5th, 1962, starting a film series that has now generated sales of £3 billion.
I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
Debonair, deadly, sexist, perhaps not the most obvious image for a country selling itself to the world. But Bond has proved enduringly popular.
Yes. Tell me, Miss Trench, do you play any other games?
After the shambles of Suez, it was no longer plausible to show the British Armed Forces as top dog. But a lone British super spy could still save the world without ruffling his Savile Row suit.
Do you expect me to talk?
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
The British public ready for a touch of glamour to replace the hard grind of post-war rebuilding.
You'll be using this Aston Martin DB5 with modifications.
And no bad thing if it also provided a shop window for the latest British gadgetry, in tune with the white heat of 60s technology. And on the same day in 1962, the Beatles released their first single, Love Me Do. It only reached number 17 in the charts, but Beatlemania had begun. The post-war baby boom brought a wave of teenagers surging through the 60s, British reserve giving way to teen hysteria.
Why, you...
While Bond was the ultimate defender of the British establishment,
my dear girl, there are some things that just aren't done, such as drinking Dom Perignon 53 above a temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit. That's as bad as listening to the Beatles without earmuffs.
The Beatles began by mocking it, the first cheeky hints of an anti-establishment decade.
Love, love me do. You know I love you.
But the two products also linked by business realities, a realization that we could still sell our culture to the world, and the world was happy to buy it.
Love me do. Whoa, love me.
Most crucially, of course, in the United States, the Beatles capturing the market in 1964.
Everybody needs a hobby.
So what's yours?
Resurrection.
Bond films now generating far more cash there than here in Britain.
007 reporting for duty.
Where the hell have you been?
Enjoying death.
Well, joining us now in the studio, the music journalist Charles Shaw Murray, and in West London, the associate editor of The Observer, Robert McCrum. Robert McCrum, you've written extensively on Britishness. Do you think 1962 was an accidental moment when a bit of music and a bit of film came out at the same day, or was it a bit of a turning point?
No, I think it was a turning point, and obviously it is an extraordinary coincidence, but I think the point is that 1962, one obvious point is that it was 17 years after the end of the Second World War. And so a whole generation has passed before you have the opportunity for a new surge of cultural excitement.
It also coincides with the pill, effectively. It's also a moment of sexual liberation, both of which are kind of expressed in both that music and in the films.
Yeah, a lot of things come together. You have the sexual liberation from the pill, you have the beginning of superpower politics. For instance, what you haven't mentioned in your remarks so far is that only a few days after the launch of Love Me Do and Dr. No, is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brings into play the whole of superpower politics, the American dimension of our lives as well. And in America at this time, you've also got the beginning of the civil rights movement with the arrival of James Meredith at the University of Mississippi. And so a lot of stuff is coming together, but it is essentially about a new generation expressing themselves in new words and new music.
That new music, I know you were only 11 at the time, but that new music has threaded right through to this moment. I mean, it's still a massive element of British culture.
Absolutely. I mean, what I mean, the arrival of the Beatles, the release of Love Me Do, even though it was only a minor hit compared with what followed, to me it coincided with leaving primary school, first term in big kids school. And the Beatles essentially tracked the 60s. You know, by the time I was out of school and into a weirder world by the time they broke up. But my entire teens and adolescence were marked out by Beatles records. I mean, with Bond, the Bond books belonged to the 50s and represented, you know, a kind of aspirational world which at the time was accessible only to, you know, the very well-off and well-connected.
Well,
exactly,
the Bond movies, posh, yes.
The Bond movies of the 60s coincided with greater consumer prosperity and, you know, the possibility of you know, foreign travel and a few nice things. And even though Bond remained the same old imperialist hero, I'd say there was a real difference between the literary Bond of the 50s and the cinematic Bond of the 60s.
But Robert McCrum, there you had this group popping up in a cavern in Liverpool, very working class, essentially. I mean, some middle class aspiration, but and then Bond, which still, as Charles Shaar Murray has said, very much top drawer, old imperialist Britain.
It's a curious combination, isn't it? But I think you know what underlies both of these phenomena is the genius of Lennon and McCartney, two of the greatest songwriters ever. We can argue about how great they are, but they are truly great, recognised internationally, and also the genius of Ian Fleming. And so what you have is, I think, this extraordinary coincidence of great lyrics and great popular literary writing.
And politically, you have today Eton expressed in the cabinet. So, I mean, and yet we have a Britain which has staged the Olympic Games, has had Coldplay, the whole kind of gamut of British culture, apparently absolutely loved across the world. I've met loads of people from all sorts of countries who really got Britishness out of that, out of the opening and closing ceremonies of both Olympics and the Paralympics, Charles.
Well, it's important also to remember that the Beatles the success of the Beatles represented a declaration of pop cultural independence from the USA, just as Bond was saying, well, you know, America might have the big money and the big weapons, but dash it all, British grit and ingenuity, etc., etc. It's also interesting that our current contemporary Bond, Daniel Craig, plays a character who is not the smug, posh git represented by Roger Moore. Because, I mean, if Sean Connery was a Scots hard man masquerading as an English gentleman, and Roger Moore was a tailor's dummy masquerading as an English gentleman.
That's very interesting, because, Robert, that still depicts a class-ridden Britain, doesn't it?
Well, not much has changed. I mean, in some ways, you could say plus ça change. In some respects, yes, I think that's very true.
Yeah, I mean, so you've got class, you've got Eton, you've got the Beatles, rock, all the rest of it.
Craig is a much less posh Bond than any of his predecessors, and I mean, there have been, you know, distressing.
Maybe the message of the whole deal is that we're more egalitarian, even though we're still a class society.
We like to think of ourselves as such, whether we are or not.
I'm going to have to thank you, Robert. Thank you both very much indeed, Kathy.